She cries. You surrender. That's not love. It's emotional blackmail, what Locke tried to warn us. Picture this scenario. Someone in your life is crying. Those tears seem to carry an implicit message about your character. And what happens next? You fold, you apologize. You surrender your position, your boundaries, your very sense of reality, all to make the emotional distress stop. You call this love. You call this compassion. You call this being caring. But what if this dynamic isn't actually love at all? What if these expressions of distress aren't always genuine vulnerability, but sometimes tools of control? What if your natural impulse to comfort is occasionally being exploited to manipulate and ultimately diminish your autonomy? John Locke, the 17th century philosopher who laid the groundwork for individual liberty and rational discourse, understood something profound about human nature that we've forgotten in our age of emotional manipulation. He recognized that true freedom, and by extension true love, can only exist between individuals who maintain their psychological sovereignty. When one person consistently uses emotional distress as a tool to override another's judgment, reason, and boundaries, what emerges isn't intimacy, it's tyranny dressed in tears. You've been conditioned to believe that another person's emotional pain automatically makes you responsible for fixing it. That emotional distress equals evidence of your failure as a partner or friend. This conditioning runs so deep that questioning it feels like questioning your very humanity. But here's the uncomfortable truth that deserves examination. Emotional manipulation through distress is one of the oldest and most effective forms of psychological control in human relationships. The theater of emotional manipulation operates on a simple premise: your discomfort with another person's distress will override your capacity for critical thinking. When someone becomes emotionally dysregulated in response to your boundaries, your ancient programming kicks in. You must fix this. You must make it stop. You must surrender whatever position, boundary, or principle is causing this distress. And in that moment of surrender, something fundamental shifts in the relationship dynamic. The distressed person learns that emotional escalation equals power. You learn that your boundaries are negotiable. Consider how this plays out in the microscopic moments of relationships. You express a need for time with friends. Emotional escalation. You question a major decision, distress. You attempt to discuss something that bothers you, tears or anger. Each time, the conversation ends not with resolution, but with you apologizing for having needs, opinions, or feelings that inconvenience the other person's emotional state. What's happening here isn't dialogue, it's conditioning. You're being trained through emotional responses. The distress becomes the negative stimulus that shapes your behavior until you learn to avoid any action that might trigger it. Over time, you stop expressing needs altogether. You edit your thoughts before they become words. You become a curator of your own authenticity, displaying only the parts of yourself that won't disturb the other person's emotional equilibrium. This isn't about dismissing genuine emotion or becoming callous to authentic pain. This is about recognizing the difference between vulnerable expression and emotional coercion. True vulnerability doesn't demand immediate capitulation. It doesn't punish you for maintaining your boundaries. It doesn't use your compassion against. Real emotional intimacy invites dialogue, not surrender. John Locke's revolutionary insight wasn't just political, it was deeply psychological. In his 2 treatises of government, he argued that legitimate authority can only exist with the consent of the governed. But translate this principle into personal relationships, and you discover something profound. Legitimate influence in a relationship can only exist with the ongoing, uncoerced consent of both parties. When someone uses emotional distress to bypass your rational faculties and force compliance, they're violating the fundamental principle of consensual interaction. They're creating what Locke would recognize as a form of tyranny, not through physical force, but through emotional coercion. Think about the last time you found yourself apologizing, not because you did something wrong, but because she was upset. Remember how you rationalized it. I don't want her to be sad. It's easier to just give in. Her feelings matter more than being right. But what you were really doing was allowing emotional manipulation to override your capacity for independent judgment. Locke understood that when people surrender their reasoning faculties to avoid discomfort, they become subjects rather than partners. And subjects, no matter how well treated, can never experience true intimacy. They can only experience the conditional approval that comes from successful submission. The person who consistently uses emotional distress to control outcomes isn't offering you partnership. They're offering you a role in their psychological hierarchy. You get to be the supporter who serves at their pleasure, whose boundaries exist only as long as they don't conflict with their emotional demands. Your thoughts, your needs, your principles all become secondary to the management of their emotional state. But here's what's truly insidious about this dynamic. It masquerades as emotional intimacy. You're told that your willingness to sacrifice your boundaries for her emotional comfort proves your love. You're told that questioning her tears makes you insensitive, cruel, emotionally unavailable. The very act of maintaining psychological sovereignty is reframed as emotional violence. This is gaslighting at its most sophisticated. It turns your strength into weakness, your clarity into confusion, your healthy boundaries into evidence of your dysfunction. And because it comes wrapped in tears and vulnerability, it becomes almost impossible to identify, let alone resist. Locke's genius was recognizing that freedom isn't the absence of influence, it's the presence of choice. In a healthy relationship, you choose to be responsive to your partner's emotional state because you value her well-being, not because you fear the consequences of refusing. The moment that choice disappears, the moment tears become ultimatums, you've crossed the line from love into emotional servitude. Consider how this plays out in the daily negotiations of relationships. Someone wants to make a major life change, and when you express reasonable concerns, they don't engage with your perspective. They become emotionally distressed about how you don't support them. You want to spend time with friends, and instead of discussing the calendar, they become upset about feeling abandoned. You question a significant decision, and rather than reviewing the situation together, they express emotional pain about feeling controlled. Each scenario follows the same pattern. Your rational input is met not with counter-argument or compromise, but with emotional escalation designed to end the discussion entirely. You're not being invited into a partnership of equals. You're being recruited into the role of emotional caretaker, where your primary function is to ensure their psychological comfort at the expense of your own autonomy. The most devastating aspect of this dynamic is how it corrupts your perception of your own emotions. You begin to see your natural resistance to manipulation as evidence of your inadequacy as a partner. Your healthy instinct to maintain boundaries becomes proof of your selfishness. Your desire for rational discourse becomes evidence of your emotional unavailability. Let's dissect this mechanism with surgical precision. Emotional blackmail operates through a predictable cycle that exploits your deepest psychological vulnerabilities. It begins with a demand, spoken or unspoken. Maybe she wants you to cancel plans with friends, change your opinion on something important, or violate a boundary you've established. When you resist, the emotional escalation begins. First comes the guilt. I can't believe you would choose that over my feelings. Then comes the victimization. You're being selfish and cruel. Finally come the tears, the nuclear option that's designed to end all rational discussion. Because what kind of monster makes a woman cry? Here's what's happening in your brain during this process. Your ancient protective instincts are being hijacked. Evolution programmed you to respond to feminine distress with immediate action. This served our species well when the threats were physical and the solutions were simple. But in the complex emotional landscape of modern relationships, this programming becomes a vulnerability that can be systematically exploited. The person employing this strategy, whether consciously or unconsciously, has learned that your discomfort with their emotional distress is greater than your commitment to your own boundaries. They've discovered that emotional escalation is more effective than logical argument. that distress can be more powerful than rational discourse. But notice what's absent from this dynamic: any genuine curiosity about your perspective, any real attempt to understand why you've taken the position you have, any acknowledgement that you might have legitimate reasons for your boundaries. Instead, there's an immediate move to emotional coercion designed to bypass your reasoning faculties entirely. This is what makes it so destructive. It doesn't just override your boundaries in the moment, it trains you to abandon them preemptively. You begin to monitor her emotional state obsessively, adjusting your behavior not based on your values or judgment, but based on your prediction of her emotional response. You become an emotional weather forecaster, constantly scanning the horizon for signs of the next storm. The tragedy is that this dynamic destroys the very intimacy it claims to protect. Real intimacy requires two psychologically sovereign individuals, choosing to be vulnerable with each other. But when one person uses emotional distress as a weapon, the other person can never fully relax into genuine vulnerability. They're always on guard, always calculating, always managing. You start editing yourself not just in your actions but in your thoughts. You begin to question your own perceptions, your own feelings, your own reality. Because if your natural responses consistently cause her distress, maybe the problem is you. Maybe you're too selfish, too insensitive, too damaged to love properly. This is the psychological quicksand of emotional manipulation. The more you struggle against it by trying to be more accommodating, more sensitive, more responsive to her emotions, the deeper you sink. Because you're not solving the real problem, you're enabling it. Watch how this unfolds in practice. You come home from work, looking forward to some quiet time, but they immediately launch into a story about their difficult day. You listen, offer support, but when you mention that you'd like some downtime, the emotional distress begins. I just needed you to be there for me, and you're being selfish. Now you're comforting them about your need for space, apologizing for having boundaries after a long day, or perhaps you've planned a weekend activity with family, something you've been looking forward to for months. When you remind them about it, they don't object directly. Instead, they become quiet, withdrawn, and eventually express emotional pain about not feeling like a priority. You find yourself canceling the plans, telling your family that something came up, and spending the weekend managing their emotional state instead. Each incident seems small in isolation. Each accommodation feels like kindness, but accumulated. Over time, these moments create a relationship where your autonomy exists only at their discretion. You've become a full-time emotional support system disguised as a partner, where your value is measured not by your authentic presence, but by your willingness to sacrifice your needs for their emotional comfort. The most insidious part is how this dynamic makes you complicit in your own psychological diminishment. You tell yourself you're being loving, understanding, mature. You pride yourself on being the kind of person who puts others' feelings first. But what you're actually doing is enabling a form of emotional dependency that harms both parties. Them, by allowing them to remain emotionally immature and controlling, and you, by systematically dismantling your psychological sovereignty. The way out of this labyrinth isn't through greater accommodation. It's through the cultivation of psychological sovereignty. This means developing the internal strength to remain calm and centered in the face of emotional storms that aren't yours to fix. Start here. The next time you encounter emotional distress that feels manipulative, resist the urge to immediately accommodate. Instead, try this. I can see that you're upset and I care about your feelings, but I'm not going to change my position based on your emotional state. When you're ready to have a calm conversation about this, I'm here. Watch what happens. If the emotional expression was genuine, they'll likely appreciate your stability and strength. They'll take time to regulate their emotions in return for genuine dialogue. But if the distress was manipulative, you'll witness an escalation. The emotional response might intensify, or it might suddenly stop and be replaced with anger, accusations, or threats. This is your diagnostic moment. Genuine emotion doesn't punish you for maintaining your boundaries. Manipulation does. Locke understood that freedom requires vigilance. Your psychological sovereignty isn't a gift that someone gives. It's a practice you must maintain daily. Every time you surrender your judgment to manage someone else's emotions, you're trading a piece of your freedom for temporary peace. The counterintuitive truth is that maintaining your boundaries in the face of emotional manipulation is the most loving thing you can do. It forces the relationship into honesty. It prevents the slow poison of resentment that builds when one person consistently sacrifices their autonomy for the other's emotional comfort. Here's what changes when you stop surrendering to emotional blackmail. Genuine problems get addressed instead of avoided. Real intimacy becomes possible because both parties are bringing their authentic selves to the relationship. Conflicts get resolved through reason and compromise rather than emotional coercion. But understand this: a person who has been using emotional distress as control will not appreciate this change initially. They may escalate their emotional manipulation, trying to find the pressure point that will return you to compliance. They may accuse you of becoming cold, distant, unloving. They may threaten to leave, or worse, threaten self-harm if you don't. Return to your previous pattern of accommodation. This is the test. Can you remain compassionate while refusing to be controlled? Can you care for someone without sacrificing your psychological freedom? Can you be strong enough to let someone be upset without making it your responsibility to fix it? The answer to these questions determines whether you'll experience healthy relationships or psychological servitude, partnership, or emotional dependency. As Locke knew, freedom isn't free. It requires the courage to stand alone when necessary. Even when someone is crying, even when they say you don't care, even when every instinct screams at you to surrender, you must develop what I call emotional immunity. The ability to remain psychologically stable in the face of another person's emotional dysregulation. This doesn't mean becoming callous or unempathetic. It means refusing to let someone else's inability to manage their emotions become your emergency. Practice phrases like, "I understand you're upset, but your emotions don't change the facts. I care about how you feel, but I won't negotiate my boundaries based on your distress. Your emotional response tells me you're in pain, but it doesn't tell me I'm wrong." The person who truly cares about you will, after the initial shock of encountering your newfound strength, begin to respect you more deeply than they ever have. They'll discover that they don't need to control you to feel secure with you. They'll learn to regulate their own emotions rather than outsourcing that responsibility to your compliance. But someone who is primarily interested in control will not adapt to this new dynamic. They'll either escalate their manipulation to increasingly desperate levels, or they'll leave in search of someone more willing to surrender their autonomy for emotional comfort. And if that happens, you haven't lost love, you've escaped dependency. Here's the paradox that Locke would have understood immediately. You can only be truly intimate with someone you're free to leave. When your boundaries are non-negotiable, when your psychological sovereignty is intact, when you're present by choice rather than compulsion, only then can genuine connection exist. Because the truth that deserves examination is this: a relationship that requires you to abandon yourself isn't healthy love at all. It's just a more sophisticated form of psychological prison. And the key to that prison isn't in their hands, it's in yours. You've had it all along. You just forgot you were free to use it. The choice, as always, is yours. But now you understand what you're choosing between. Will you choose the temporary peace of accommodation or the lasting freedom of sovereignty? Will you be a partner or a subject? Will you connect from strength or serve from weakness? Your answer to these questions will determine not just the quality of your relationships, but the quality of your entire life. Choose wisely. Your future self is counting on it.